something wasn't right from the very beginning. Not in the way that things are obvious in hindsight. Not in the way that people say, of course, the signs were all there. It was subtler than that, and in some ways, far more disturbing. Because Jennifer Kesse didn't disappear into chaos. She didn't vanish after a fight, or a late night out, or a walk down the wrong street at the wrong hour. She disappeared between the moment she laid out her clothes for work and the moment she should have walked through her office door. Somewhere in that window, a few quiet hours in an ordinary Tuesday morning in Orlando, Florida, a 24-year-old woman simply ceased to exist. And what was left behind was just enough to haunt everyone who looked for her. Her name was Jennifer Joyce Kesse, 24 years old, a finance manager at a timeshare company in Ocoee, Florida. She'd recently bought her own condo, a gated community with an on-site security guard, which she'd chosen specifically because it felt safe. By every account from the people who knew her, Jennifer was not careless. She was deliberate. She carried pepper spray. She paid attention to her surroundings. Her best friend, Lauren McCarthy, would later describe her as extremely safety conscious. Someone who thought about these things, who planned ahead, who understood that the world could be unkind if you let your guard down. Which is exactly what makes this case so deeply unsettling. Because Jennifer Kesse did everything right. She lived in a gated building. She was aware of her environment. She was careful with her routines, and none of it was enough. The weekend before she vanished, Jennifer had been in St. Croix, the U.S. Virgin Islands, with her boyfriend Rob Allen, who lived in Fort Lauderdale, about 3 hours south of Orlando. They'd had a good trip. Nothing remarkable. Just a couple away together, coming back to the ordinary rhythm of their lives. Jennifer flew back to Orlando on Sunday, January 22nd. She spent that night at Rob's place and then drove directly to work the next morning, Monday, January 23rd. A normal day, a full day at the office. She clocked out at around 6 in the evening and headed home. She called her father while she was driving. They talked for a few minutes, the way families do, the easy, comfortable kind of conversation that nobody remembers in detail because there's no reason to. It was just a check-in, just her dad, just a Monday evening. Later that night, at around 10 o'clock, she called Rob. They talked. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. She was home, she was winding down, and she had work again in the morning. Those were the last words anyone would ever hear from Jennifer Kesse. Tuesday morning, January 24th, Jennifer didn't send Rob her usual text. She didn't call before leaving for work the way she normally did, Rob noticed. He tried to reach her and couldn't. He left messages, and like a lot of people do when something feels slightly off, but not alarming enough to act on, he told himself she was probably just busy, probably had an early meeting, probably caught up in something at the office. But Jennifer never arrived at the office. When she didn't show up and didn't call, her employer reached out to her family. Her parents, Drew and Joyce Kesse, got in their car and made the 2-hour drive to Orlando. Meanwhile, at approximately 7:40 in the morning, witnesses near Jennifer's apartment complex reportedly saw her Chevy Malibu leaving the parking lot, driving erratically. She wasn't behind the wheel. Or if she was, something was very wrong. When Drew and Joyce Kesse arrived at their daughter's condo, what they found was perhaps the most quietly chilling detail of this entire case. There were no signs of struggle, no broken locks, no upturned furniture, no evidence that anything had gone wrong at all. What they found instead was a life mid-pause, a damp towel on the bathroom floor, the kind you leave when you've just stepped out of the shower, clothes laid out on the bed, as if Jennifer had set them there while deciding what to wear, makeup on the counter, some of it used, some of it waiting. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Jennifer had gotten up that morning, showered, gotten herself ready, and walked out the door. And then something happened. Something between the threshold of her front door and the parking lot of her gated building. Something no camera fully captured and no witness could explain. 2 days later, on January 26th, Jennifer's car was found. A Chevy Malibu, parked in a lot approximately 1 mile from her apartment. But the car hadn't been sitting there since Tuesday morning. Surveillance footage from a camera at a nearby apartment complex showed the vehicle being dropped off at approximately noon on January 24th. Around the same time, Jennifer's parents were making their way to Orlando. Someone had driven Jennifer's car to that lot and then walked away. And here is where the case becomes something else entirely. Because that surveillance camera, it captured them. Frame by frame, every 3 seconds, it photographed the person who parked Jennifer's car and walked away. In every single frame, a fence post blocked the person's face, not partially, not in a way where enhancement could recover something useful. In every frame, at every angle, the fence post was there. The face was gone, as if the parking lot itself had decided to keep the secret. The FBI analyzed the footage. NASA enhanced it. And the conclusion, after all of that effort and expertise, was this. The person was likely between 5'3" and 5'5". Their gender was never confirmed. Their race was never confirmed. Their age was never confirmed. They appeared to be wearing clothing similar to what a painter or construction worker might wear, and they were calm. Deliberately, unnervingly calm. Before getting out of the car, they sat there for approximately 30 seconds, just sitting, not panicking, not rushing, not checking over their shoulder the way a frightened person would. They sat, and then they got out, and they walked away. Forensic teams processed Jennifer's car carefully. They recovered a latent fingerprint, a small amount of DNA material, and photographs of the vehicle showed markings on the hood, markings that were described as consistent with a possible struggle. A search dog was brought in. It tracked a scent from the abandoned car, back toward Jennifer's apartment complex. That detail matters. It suggests the person who parked the car didn't come from far away. They walked back toward where they came from, toward Jennifer's building, toward her neighborhood, toward somewhere they knew. Jennifer's condo complex had been something of a construction zone in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Work was ongoing, and a number of construction workers, apparently without formal lease agreements, had been living in vacant units on the property. Jennifer had mentioned them to her family. Not once, but multiple times. She'd told them that some of the workers had catcalled her, that they'd made comments as she came and went, that it made her uncomfortable. This detail became central to what private investigator Michael Toretta would later identify as the most plausible theory in the case. Toretta, hired by Jennifer's parents years after her disappearance, reviewed the case files multiple times and conducted fresh interviews. His conclusion was that one or more of those construction workers, men who lived in a unit directly across from Jennifer's, men who watched her leave every morning, men who knew her face and her routine, had abducted her as she locked her door and headed for work. A targeted abduction. Planned, or at least opportunistic in the most terrible sense. Someone who saw her often enough to know exactly when she'd be vulnerable. The behavioral analysis of the case seemed to support this. Whoever parked that car was not in a panic. They were not improvising. They sat for 30 seconds in a vehicle that wasn't theirs, in the middle of a day when Jennifer Kesse had just been reported missing. And they walked away like it was nothing. That's not someone acting in the heat of the moment. That's someone who had thought about this, someone who knew the area, someone who had reason to believe they wouldn't be caught. The investigation, though, ran into walls almost immediately. Many of the construction workers at the complex had no formal paperwork tying them to the property. No leases, no records. By the time investigators looked closely, a number of them were simply gone. Difficult or impossible to trace. A language barrier complicated things further. Investigators reportedly struggled to fully interrogate some of the workers they did locate, and potential leads went undeveloped. There was also the matter of the security cameras. The system at Jennifer's condo complex had not yet been fully installed at the time she disappeared. There were gaps, significant gaps, in the surveillance coverage of the very building she'd chosen for its safety. And then there was something else. About 1 month before Jennifer vanished, a set of keys to the complex had been stolen. 1 month before, keys to a gated building, to the building where Jennifer lived. Whether that theft was connected to what happened to her, no one has been able to say with certainty. But the coincidence has never stopped being difficult to ignore. In 2009, 3 years after Jennifer's disappearance, a detective made contact with a former housekeeper from the complex, someone who had somehow never been interviewed during the original investigation. When the detective showed this woman the surveillance photograph, the grainy, fence-blocked image of the person who had parked Jennifer's car, she said something that caught everyone's attention. She said the walk looked familiar, the clothing, the hairstyle. She said it resembled someone she knew from the complex, someone who had worked there as a maintenance worker, someone she knew by the name Chino. Investigators looked into it. No arrest followed. The years passed, and Drew and Joyce Kesse refused to let the case fade quietly. They stayed at Jennifer's condo for months after she vanished, holding vigils, speaking to the press, pressing authorities. In 2018, they filed a lawsuit against the Orlando Police Department and ultimately obtained more than 16,000 pages of case documents. In those documents, they found something that enraged them. DNA evidence collected from Jennifer's case, evidence recovered in those early days after she disappeared, had never been fully tested. For nearly 20 years, material that might have identified a suspect sat untested in an evidence file. Jennifer's family had no idea. In December of 2022, the case was transferred to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Cold Case Unit, and something began to shift. By May of 2025, FDLE agents had reviewed thousands of pages of documents and spoken with approximately 45 individuals. They announced that several persons of interest had been identified. They said, for the first time in a long time, that the case was no longer considered cold. Then, in October of 2025, Drew Kesse announced something that stopped people in their tracks. FDLE investigators had found DNA on evidence that had never previously been tested. New DNA from material that had been sitting in the case files, overlooked, untouched, for nearly 2 decades. Drew Kesse said the list of persons of interest had been significantly narrowed. He said investigators now had a better chance of finding Jennifer than at any point in the previous 20 years. The FDLE also mentioned something else: the possibility of using artificial intelligence to enhance and reanalyze the original surveillance footage. The footage of the person behind the fence post, the face that had never been seen clearly enough. After all this time, after all those years of that single blurry figure walking away from Jennifer's car, technology might finally be able to tell us who that person was. There is a particular kind of cruelty in cases like this one. It isn't the absence of evidence. That would almost be easier to accept. The idea that everything was erased, that there was nothing left to find. But that's not what happened here. What happened here is that the evidence existed. The fingerprint was there. The DNA was there. The footage was there. A witness emerged years later who recognized something in that walk, that clothing, that silhouette. The evidence was always almost enough. The face was always just behind the post. The trail always led back toward the building, but never through the door. It's the kind of case that keeps investigators awake, that keeps a family driving 2 hours down a Florida highway again and again, long after most people would have given up. That keeps a father making phone calls and press statements and fighting for answers to a question that should have been answered 19 years ago. Jennifer Kesse remains on the FBI's most wanted missing persons list. She is considered missing and endangered by the Orlando Police Department, the FBI, the Orange County Sheriff's Office, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and Interpol. She has never been found. No arrests have ever been made. Artem, what strikes me most about this case, the thing I keep coming back to, is that moment in the surveillance footage, that 30-second pause. Whoever sat in Jennifer's car that Tuesday afternoon knew something the rest of us didn't. They had information that changed everything about the situation, and they just sat there with it, calm as anything, and then they walked away. 30 seconds. Composure. Purpose. That's not someone who stumbled into this. That's someone who had thought about it. Someone who had watched and waited and chosen their moment. And for 19 years, they have been out there, perhaps living an ordinary life, perhaps watching these stories unfold in the news, perhaps knowing that the fence post saved them. But the world is changing. The DNA that sat untested for 2 decades is being tested now. The footage that defeated every expert who looked at it might soon face tools that didn't exist when Jennifer disappeared. The persons of interest who once seemed beyond reach are being found and spoken to. The case isn't cold anymore. That's what they're saying. And if you have ever known anything about what happened to Jennifer Kesse, anything at all, no matter how small it seemed at the time, The Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Orlando office is still taking tips. The number is 407-245-0888. Jennifer was 24 years old. She had a family who loved her, a life she had built carefully and deliberately, a future she never got to live. Somewhere in the space between a Tuesday morning shower and an erratically driven car leaving a parking lot, she was taken. And Drew and Joyce Kesse have spent the better part of 2 decades refusing to let that be the end of her story. Neither should we.